All right, guys, chapter 17, we're going to be moving our focus to the diversity of American colonial societies. We're going to be looking from about 1530 to about 1770. These are our objectives, instructional objectives. I'm going to give you a little few seconds to look over those so that you understand where we are focused for this chapter. All right, so let's get started. All right, so we're first going to get into the Colombian Exchange a little bit. So this is the period really after global exploration and then the development of global trade has begun. And so we're going to look at some of the changes, demographic changes that happened. The peoples in the New World lacked immunity to diseases from the Old World: smallpox, measles, diphtheria, typhus, influenza, malaria, yellow fever, and maybe pulmonary plague caused severe declines in populations of native peoples in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Similar patterns of contagion and mortality may be observed in the English and French colonies in North America. Europeans did not use disease as a tool of empire, but the spread of the old world diseases clearly undermined the ability of native peoples to resist settlement, and it accelerated the global cultural change. And so this brings us into the actual plants, animals, what we typically know as the Colombian Exchange a little bit better. The European, Asian, and African food crops were introduced to the Americas, while American crops, including maize, beans, potatoes, tobacco, were brought to the Eastern Hemisphere. The introduction of New World crops is thought to be one factor contributing to the rapid growth of world population after 1700. The introduction of European livestock such as cattle, pigs, horses, and sheep had a dramatic influence on the environment and on the cultures of the native peoples of the Americas. Old World livestock destroyed the crops of some Amerindian farmers. Other Amerindians benefited from the introduction of cattle, sheep, and horses. And so this is where the exchange takes place. We typically learn about the happy part of history where it is just trading plants and animals, but that disease factor, that's an important component that you have to remember. So let's talk about Spanish America and Brazil. And we're going to look at the state and church first. The Spanish crown tried to exert direct control over the American colonies, but the difficulty of communication between Spain and the New World led to a situation in which the viceroys of New Spain and Peru and their subordinate officials enjoyed really a substantial degree of autonomy and power. After some years of neglect and mismanagement, the Portuguese in 1720 appointed a viceroy to administer Brazil. The governmental institutions established by Spain and Portugal were highly developed, costly bureaucracies that thwarted local economic initiative and political experimentation. The Catholic Church played an important role in transferring European language, culture, and Christian beliefs to the New World. Catholic clergy converted large numbers of Amerindians, although some of them secretly held onto some of their native beliefs and practices. That's actually a little more widespread than just some. Catholic clergy also acted to protect Amerindians from the exploitation and abuse of Spanish settlers. One example is Bartolome de las Casas, a former settler turned priest who denounced Spanish policies towards the Amerindians and worked to improve the status of Amerindians through legal reforms such as the new laws of 1542. So he was a bit progressive for his time. Catholic missionaries were frustrated as Amerindian converts blended Christian beliefs with the elements in their own cosmology and ritual. In response, the church redirected its energies towards the colonial cities and towns, where the church founded universities and secondary schools and played a significant role in the intellectual and economic life of the colonies. And so they realized that they're going to maintain some of their original beliefs, and so they're going to have to try to do it through education, get them from a younger age, things like that. So let's look at the colonial economies. The colonial economies of Latin America were dominated by the silver mines of Peru and Mexico and by the sugar plantations of Brazil. This led to a dependence on mineral and agricultural exports. The economy of the Spanish colonies were dominated by the silver mines of Alto, Peru, Bolivia, and Peru until 1680, and then by the silver mines of Mexico. Silver mining and processing required large labor force and led to environmental effects that included deforestation and mercury poisoning. In the agricultural economy that dominated Spanish America up to the 1540s, Spanish settlers used the forced labor system known as encomienda, which I believe is right there. Yep, encomienda, to exploit the Amerindian labor. With the development of silver mining economies, new systems of labor exploitation were devised. In Mexico, free wage labor, and in Peru, the mita. Under the mita system, 1/7 of adult male Amerindians were drafted for forced labor at less than subsistent wages for 2 to 4 months of the year. The mita system undermined the traditional agricultural economy, weakened Amerindian village life, and promoted the assimilation of Amerindians into Spanish colonial society. The Portuguese developed the African slave labor sugar plantation system in the Atlantic islands and then set up similar plantations in Brazil. The Brazilian plantations were first used Amerindian slaves, and then the more expensive but more productive and more disease-resistant African slaves. Now, disease-resistant and more production is a key part, but also many of the locals, many of the Amerindians were also simply fleeing into the forest where many of the Europeans were not going to follow. They knew the terrain better. Sugar and silver played important roles in integrating the American colonial economies into a system of world trade. So let's look at society in colonial and Latin America. The elite Spanish America consisted of a relatively small number of Spanish immigrants and a larger number of their American-born descendants, or Creoles. The Spanish-born dominated the highest levels of government, church, and business, while the Creoles controlled agriculture and mining. Under colonial rule, the cultural diversity of Amerindian peoples and the class differentiation within the Amerindian ethnic groups both were eroded. People of African descent played various roles in the history of Spanish colonies. Slaves and free blacks from the Iberian Peninsula participated in the conquest of the settlement of Spanish America. Later, the direct slave trade with Africa led to both an increase in the number of blacks and to the decline in the legal status of blacks in the Spanish colonies. At first, people were brought from various parts of Africa, retained their different cultural identities, but with time, their various traditions blended and mixed with European and Amerindian languages and beliefs to form distinctive local cultures. Slave resistance, including rebellions, were always brought under control, but runaway slaves occasionally formed groups that defended themselves for years. Most slaves were engaged in agricultural labor and were forced to submit to harsh discipline and brutal punishments. The overwhelming preponderance of males made it possible for slaves to preserve traditional African family and marriage patterns or adopt those of Europe. In colonial Brazil, Portuguese immigrants controlled politics and the economy, but by the early 17th century, Africans and their American-born descendants, both slave and free, were the largest ethnic group. The growing population of individuals of mixed European and Amerindian descent, known as mestizos, European and African descent, known as mulattoes, and mixed African and Amerindian descent were known collectively as castas. This is a great map showing you kind of the different areas that we just discussed. If you look, there's Brazil, which really dominates and still dominates South America. You also see Mexico, gives you an idea of where some of the silver mines were at that they were talking about, which, if you remember, is one of the major reasons for Europeans wanting to be there. All right, so now we're going to move into the English and French colonies of North America. So we're going to look at early English experiments, and we're just going to really go south to north. So early English settlements. Attempts to establish colonies in the Americas in the late 16th century ended in failure. In the 17th century, hope that the colonies would prove to be profitable investments, combined with the successful colonization of Ireland, led to a new wave of interest in establishing colonies in the New World. The first known colony that took place was actually off the coast of Virginia. It was a settlement where they put, I think, about 60 people there, and they, because of war and lack of funds, the leaders had to go back to Europe. Well, they weren't able to get back because of war for 3 years, and they essentially just were lost in time. Many people think they were think they were killed by Indians, but there's a lot of evidence out there that proves that they were actually just assimilated into the Indian culture. Okay, the only thing they found when they got back was the inscription CROA, which was the Croatian Indian nearby, inscribed on a tree. And so that was really the first failure. Then in the South, you have the establishment of the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company established the colony of Jamestown on an unhealthy island in the James River in 1606. After the English crown took over management of the colony in 1624, Virginia, which is in the Chesapeake Bay area, developed as a tobacco plantation economy with a dispersed population and with no city of significant size. The plantations of the Chesapeake Bay area initially relied on British indentured servants for labor. As life expectancy increased, planters came to prefer to invest in slaves. The slave population in Virginia increased from 950 in 1660 to 120,000 in 1756. A lot of the slaves that were there initially were actually had a, yes, they were slaves, but they were still treated with a high level of respect because of the work they were doing to really push the economy forward. It wasn't like what we stereotype as slave labor later on, leading into the American Civil War. Virginia was administered by a crown-appointed governor and by representatives of the towns meeting together in what became known as the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses developed into a form of democratic representation at the same time as slavery was growing. Colonists in the Carolinas first prospered in the fur trade with Amerindian deer hunters. The consequences of the fur trade included environmental damage brought on by overhunting, Amerindian dependency on European goods, ethnic conflicts among Amerindians fighting over hunting grounds, and a series of unsuccessful Amerindian attacks on the English colonists in the 1700s. The southern part of the Carolinas was settled by planters from Barbados and developed slave labor plantation economies, producing rice and indigo. Enslaved Africans and their descendants formed the majority population and developed their own culture. A slave uprising known as the Stono Rebellion in 1739 led to more repressive policies towards slaves throughout the southern colonies. And so that is where the Stono Rebellion and what you see after, that is where you start to see what we know and have studied with the abuse of slaves. That's where it begins. Colonial South America was the most hierarchical society in the British North America. A wealthy planter class dominated a population of small farmer, merchants, cattle ranchers, artisans, and fur traders who, in turn, stood above the people of mixed English and Amerindian or English and African background and slaves. And so you have this highly diverse and heavily relied upon labor force developing in this region. So let's move to New England. The Pilgrims, who wanted to break completely with the Church of England, established a small Plymouth colony in 1620. The Puritans, who wanted only to reform the Church of England, reformed a chartered joint stock company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had a normal gender balance, saw a rapid increase in population, and was more homogeneous and less hierarchical than the southern colonies. The political institutions of the colony were derived from the terms of its charter and included an elected governor and, in 1650, a lower legislative house. Without the soil or climate to produce cash crops, the Massachusetts economy evolved from independence on fur, forest products, and to fish and fish to a dependence on commerce and shipping. Massachusetts merchants engaged in diversified trade across the Atlantic, which made Boston the largest city in British North America by 1740. Now we're going to move to the Middle Atlantic region. Manhattan Island was first colonized by the Dutch and then taken by the English and renamed New York. New York became a commercial and shipping center. It derived particular benefit from its position as an outlet for the export of grain to the Caribbean and southern Europe. Pennsylvania was first developed as a proprietary colony for the Quakers, but soon developed into a wealthy grain exporting colony with Philadelphia as its major commercial city. In contrast to rice exporting South Carolina's slave agriculture, Pennsylvania's grain was produced by free family farmers, including a substantial number of Germans that went there. Hopefully you guys are starting to see kind of the difference of how each area was able to develop, what crops were important, what materials were important, and really what type of labor was important as well. Let's look at French America. Patterns of French settlement closely resembled those of Spain and Portugal. The French were committed to missionary work as they emphasized the extraction of natural resources, which at that time was furs. French expansion was driven by the fur trade and resulted in deep depletion of beaver and deer populations and made the Amerindians dependent on European goods. The fur trade provided Amerindians with firearms, which increased the violence of wars that they fought over control of hunting grounds. Catholic missionaries, including Jesuits, attempted to convert the Amerindian population of French America, but meeting with indigenous resistance. They turned their attention to work within the French settlements. The settlements dependent on fur trade were small, but they grew. The pattern of settlement followed Amerindians in French America to preserve greater degree of independence that they could in the Spanish, Portuguese, and British colonies. The French expanded aggressively to the west and south, establishing a second fur trading colony in Louisiana in 1699. The expansion led to a war with England, in which the French, defeated in 1759, were forced to yield Canada to the English and cede Louisiana to Spain. And so after that war, they simply lost everything. Another map that shows you what areas were controlled before the French and Indian War, and this is what it looked like after the French and Indian War. So let's look at colonial expansion and conflict now. So you have some imperial reforms in the Spanish America and Brazil, and then we're going to look at British North America as well. After 1713, Spain's New Bourbon dynasty undertook a series of administrative reforms, including expanded intercolonial trade, new commercial monopolies on certain goods, a stronger navy, and better policing of trade in contraband goods to the Spanish colonies. Threatened by independence of power of the Jesuit influence, both Portuguese and Spanish monarchies expelled them from their American colonies. The Bourbon policies were detrimental to the interests of the grazing and agriculture export economies, which were increasingly linked to illegitimate trade with the English, French, and Dutch. The new monopolies aroused opposition from Creole elites whose only gain from the reforms was their role as leaders of militias that were intended to encounter the threat of war with England. The Bourbon policies were also a factor in the Amerindian uprisings, including the uprising led by Peruvian Amerindian leader Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui, basically also known as Tupac Amaru II. No relation to the actual Tupac. The rebellion was suppressed after more than 2 years and cost the Spanish colonies over 100,000 lives and enormous amounts of property damage. Brazil underwent a period of economic expansion and administrative reform in the 1700s. Economic expansion fueled by gold, diamonds, coffee, and cotton underwrote a lot of these reforms, paid for by the importation of nearly 2 million African slaves, and underwent a new wave of British imports. And so now let's move a little bit north to reform and reorganization in British America. In the latter half of the 17th century, the British Crown tried to control colonial trading, or what was known as smuggling, and manufactured by passing a series of navigation acts and by suspending the elected assemblies of the New England colonies. Colonists resisted by overthrowing the governors of New York and Massachusetts and by removing the Catholic proprietor of Maryland, thus setting the stage for future confrontational politics. During the 18th century, economic growth and new immigration into the British colonies was accompanied by increased urbanization and more stratified social culture. So in conclusion, we're going to look at a couple different comparisons again. We have the political and economic comparisons, and then we have the environmental and cultural comparisons. And so let's start with the political and economic. 1. Amerindians in the colonies of Spain, Portugal, France, and England all experienced European subjugation. 2. Of the Catholic powers of Spain, Portugal, and France, Spain gained the most wealth and developed the most centralized control. And then in 3, British colonial governments were more likely to develop according to local interests than the French, Spanish, and Portugal's colonial governments. And then we have the environmental and cultural comparisons. The environments in the colonies underwent change from the introduction of European technology, animals, and plants. 2, all lost natural resources to European markets. 3, the Catholic nations forced more cultural uniformity on their colonies than the British did in the more religiously and ethnically diverse British colonies. And 4, the British colonies welcomed a much larger influx of European migrants than did the other